All right, in this video, I want to go over what is a Readme file and what is a Git Ignore file, and talk about their use cases and how we would use them with Git and GitHub. And so before I do that, I want to briefly go back to talking about remote repositories and local repositories, more specifically talking about how do we create remote branches and sync up our local branches. And so yes, you can have a master branch in your remote repository, but you can also create multiple remote branches and sync those up as well. And so, for instance, let's go to our repo here. So in our repo, we have one master branch, but if you click on this button here, we can create multiple branches within our remote repository. And so let's go ahead and create a branch called test_remote. And it gives the illusion that we basically replicated the project, and that new project that we created in our remote repository is called test remote. Let's say, for instance, I want to bring down, or I wanted to begin to just work on this branch called test remote. I can go and add files here. I can go and say, create a new file. I can upload files. But what if I wanted to go and bring up my local repository here? Just want to clear. And let's go and actually begin to work with our local repository. Work with our local repository, but then push it up to that specific branch that we just created called a test remote within our remote repository. I know it's a lot of language here with remote and local, but follow me here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a local repository. So I'm going to say git, and I'll say branch, and I'll just say test, and I'll name it the same as my remote branch. So I created that branch, and so if I say git branch, you'll see all the branches that I have. I have one called master, one called test remote. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to check out to my test remote, and the command for that is git checkout test_remote. So that switches me to my test remote local branch, and you'll see that here in purple where my mouse is hovering. We're on that test remote branch. What I'm going to do here is make some alterations, make some adjustments. What I'll do, and I'll just create a variable here, say var, and say pretty good instructor, or C web instructor, and I'll say equals C, or let's say R bent. All right. And then here we just do a little bit of string interpolation. And remember, for string interpolation, you need those backticks. All right, and I think that'll do it there. So we'll save that. We just made a minor change here. We added some information to the function. Git instructor. So that's going to run through the git command workflow. So we'll say git status. We made a change to the test.js. We'll say git add, and we'll just say test.js. Instead of doing a period, we could do the period. Either one will work. We just do a commit -m for message space, and then we'll say adding variable to git instructor function. And then at this point, if we do a git status, our branch should be clean. And if we do a git log, it'll show us all the different changes that we've made or commits that we've made. If you ever run into this where you have a colon, you can hit WQ, and that'll get you out of this particular log area. So our functionality, we added some functionality to the test remote branch. What we're going to do is we want to switch gears and go back to the master branch. But before we do that, let's say that we don't want to go to the master branch. We want to basically push up the changes from test remote to the remote branch that we just created here in our remote repository, right? Because right now we go to test.js, the functionality that we added a variable, and we added some information on, but it's not reflected in our remote repository. And so we can actually go ahead and push up to the test remote without actually pushing to the master. And you may be asking the question, why would you want to do that? And reason being is when we get to talking about how to use GitHub as a team, sometimes you only want to work within your branch. And so you could create multiple branches in terms of some of the added functionality we add into the application. So one team member may be working on the contact page, another team member may be working on the CSS presentation, the style sheet, and they may have a branch specifically to work on that functionality. And so you just may want to work only in your branch. So let's go and push up our code only to the test remote branch. So here, I'm going to jump back to my editor, and I'll just do a quick clear my terminal. And I'm going to watch my command here. It's going to be a push command. So I'll say git push origin, but this time I'm going to actually push to the branch name that I created in my remote repository. So I'll say git push test remote. And so that's done, and that's pushed up to our test remote. And so if you go back to our code here, you'll see that if we refresh, we go down, you'll see that the added functionality is there, right? On line 20 and then on line 21, where we did a little bit of string concatenation there. So that's a way that we can work with multiple branches in our remote repository, but also create multiple branches in our local repository. And so you don't have to just work in master, but you can have multiple branches in either repository and begin to sync them up. Like I said, that was not the meat of this repository. I'm sorry, the meat of this tutorial or this video. But really what I wanted to talk about in this video was Readme files and Git Ignore files. So let me say a few words about what is a Readme file and then what is a Git Ignore file, and then we'll move on and talk about how to use Git and GitHub as a team. So let's skip here to the Git Ignore file. So a Git Ignore file is going to basically allow you to ignore certain files that you do not want to host in your remote repository. All right. And so there may be a file such as a .txt file that holds all your passwords or holds certain API keys that you do not want to expose. And so a Git Ignore file will be placed inside of your project folder of your repository, and you can put in a certain syntax or a certain a pattern, and it will escape certain files or escape certain information or folders. So for instance here, if you look at this this image here, if we want to ignore the file readme.txt, we would create a file called, an extension is essentially .gitignore. So nothing would go before the period, but we would, within that file, we would put readme.txt. If you wanted to ignore a folder, you would put output / and that would ignore any file or folder called output. If you wanted to ignore all Java files, you would just put this asterisk, no matter what the first name of the file or the name of the file would be, but any file that ends with .java extension, it would ignore those files. And so this would be an example of that, where we can actually ignore certain files in our repository. And like I said, the key here is that if you set it to public, there's some files in here that you do not want to be exposed. I know one of the common mistakes that a lot of students make is that, especially if they have a full stack web application and it's connected to a database, they will put in the database information or the credentials, and they would not ignore that file that holds the credentials for the database. And so a lot of people can hack. They can pull down a repository and hack into your application because you've exposed your credentials. And this, like I said, in those cases there, you will want to most likely take your credentials and put it into a separate file, such as a txt file, and then you will want to ignore the file so that it's not hosted in a public repository. So in this case here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a Git Ignore file. And I could essentially just do this here. I could say touch. Before I do that, I'm going to skip back to the master branch. So let's say get a status, make sure everything is clean. Let's go and get a git checkout back to the master. And let's go and do a touch command, touch.git ignore. And remember, nothing goes in front of the .git ignore, because essentially it's just kind of an extension. And we hit enter. And so here you'll see that now we have this Git Ignore file within our project folder. And let's say that we wanted to ignore any file. Let's create a new file here. Let's call this file password.txt. And in password.txt, we're going to put pass username or API key. And we just say, just put some random stuff there, right? So this is something sensitive that we don't want to get exposed. We may be using this API key within our file somewhere. But let's say we don't want the password.txt file to be show up within our public repository. So in this case here, what we can do is say, okay, hey, let's open up our Git Ignore file, and I can go ahead and just put password.txt. Now you may not know like the syntax here to put to escape or ignore files. Like I said, our documentation here shows you an example of that. And so you can say readme.txt, and there's, if you put an asterisk, these are some of the most commonly used pattern matching patterns that you can use to escape files. But in our case here, we just if we only want to ignore that password.txt file, we'll just put the name of it and then we'll save it. So let's jump back to our code and we'll save it. So we have this saved within our Git Ignore file. And what we're going to do is we're going to push this up. So when we push this up, we should not be able to see the password.txt file. But before we do that, let's go and actually run through the Git commands. So git status, git add, git commit, adding git ignore file. And then what we're going to do is we'll git push origin master. So that's going to push up to our remote repository. And then if we go back to our remote repository, you'll see that when we refresh back to our master, you'll see that that password.txt file did not come along with the Git Ignore file. Now, if we click on the Git Ignore file, right, it shows us that we're ignoring the password.txt, but we do not see the password.txt file within our repository. All right, so that's an example of the Git Ignore file. And like I said, you will use that especially when you want some files to be hidden within a public repository. Not everybody needs access to all your API keys or your passwords because that's a security issue. Here's a good site. Somebody put this together, and it gives you basically a list of all the different, you can put in for instance, a particular programming language or an IDE. And what it'll do is, so if we put in, let's say, Node, right? It'll give you an example of some of the things that you may want to escape or that you may want to include within your Git Ignore file, right? So some of the things that you necessarily don't need to host in your GitHub repository. So this is a good tool that I tend to use frequent sometimes, and just to get some ideas on in terms of some of the things that I don't need to expose within my remote repository. Last but not least, I know this video is getting kind of long here. Let's talk about a Readme file. And I'll just say a few words about this here. A Readme file is basically going to provide documentation to your repository. So if we go to our repository here, we can quickly add a Readme here. And we can basically begin to provide some what we call Markdown syntax. There's a great PDF. If I go, let me pull it up here. Give me 1 second. All right, so that Markdown, I went to go retrieve that Markdown sheet. This is also posted in our course site under the respective module. But here is, you would say Markdown syntax is somewhat very close to, it's related. It's like HTML, right? So if you look here where my mouse is hovering, this is how you would specify an H1 in Markdown. This is how you specify H2. You can do list items. You can do images within Markdown. And so there's a lot of, it basically allows you to mark up the content. And it's a certain syntax or a certain way that you will want to mark it up. And this would be a great PDF to look to the reference when you're creating your Markdown. Now, there's a GitHub flavor of Markdown, which there's some additional things you can do within a GitHub Markdown document. And this here at the bottom, this second column here will show you some of those things, or second row. So you can add emojis, you can do tables, and you can do kind of task lists and so forth, and even coding blocks. For instance, if you want to add a coding block of JavaScript, you can do that here where my mouse is hovered. So jumping back here to our repository, right? We're going to add us a little bit of text here. We'll say this is our GitHub tutorial repository. And I'll add a few more things here just to demonstrate some of these things here. So we'll let's add a paragraph. I think for a paragraph, you just basically put plain text. And so if you go back here, we can just hit enter. This story is an example using some repository, right? So we'll save that, and just like with any file, you have to go through the whole workflow here. So we'll say not git status, but we have to say create a readme file, or you can put whatever text you want. And we'll just hit commit. So now you'll see that I have some documentation here. This is our GitHub tutorial repository. This repository is an example of using some of the Git commands to publish work to a remote repository. And I can add more, right? And so I would invite you to play around, add more to your documentation. And like I said, the whole point of this README file is to let the end users know, or the folks who will be coming to this repository, or your team know, steps on how to get started with this repository. This is a great way of documenting your code, and so forth. Another tool that I like to use here is this one called Make a README. And this here just allows you to kind of do some live editing. And so this is live editing a README file. Right, and they have the coding block, and this one is for Python. We could do for JavaScript here and say JavaScript, and it'll change the syntax here, but we can say, you know, console.log. This is a README. Right, and so you can change the language, and so it'll kind of give this output here, and then here you can do some hyperlinks. And this will be the syntax to do a hyperlink. So, and at this point, you can just copy this if you wanted to, and you can put it into your README and then make the commit. So like I said, really good thing for our documentation, and you want to use this to really give the end user an idea of what's in your repository, how to get started with your repository. And I would encourage, and you can see that with people, there are some people who've done a really good job with doing some of their different repositories in terms of documentation. So I would say browse some of the different repositories on GitHub, and you'll see what people have done with these README files. But these are important because it helps the end user know how to get started with your project, or some of the information, helpful information that would be useful to them as they work with your files. All right, so that's a README file, and that's the Git Ignore. Like I said, practice, play around with it. Feel free to use these resources as you add README files to your projects, as well as you ignore certain files from your repositories. All right.